I'm really happy to be here. I'm Dr. Beverly Rubik, a biophysicist and independent scientist from the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's a pleasure for me to be back in Chicagoland because I was born and raised here and left 50 years ago to go to graduate school in Berkeley. And I'm sorry to say really how California has changed. I went from peace and love in the early 70s, and you may know that movement, and now it's tyranny. And laws that I can't imagine would ever pass are happening. Central New World Order, California is. So I'm going to talk about the perils of wireless communication. And the first part of my talk will be a bit of an overview. And I have to kind of condense it a bit because I planned really for an hour, and now I learned they wanted a little shorter. So I'll go more quickly through the adverse health effects and the possible role in the COVID pandemic, because I want to focus on solutions for you to implement. That's why you're here. First, the bad news, and then what can we do about it approach. So let's get started. So you know there's a plethora of wireless devices now in our environment. It's been increasing over the decades, and we don't really know the long-term effects on this on anybody's health, on people's health, on the health of the environment, etc. And what we're doing now by adding 5G, in my opinion, is really terraforming planet Earth away from life as we know it for a world of robotics. Because 5G is really more about communication between machines. And so what's our position in it, really? Well, that remains to be seen. We need light. As you know, the sun gives us continuous, what we call analog light, and that's healthy. It's been known a long time, and yet it seems that we're told that the sun is dangerous, stay out of there. And that's all wrong. We really need light. All life forms do. And we get natural light from the sun with the spectrum that kind of peaks in the yellow and green. And sun doesn't put out any microwaves. All of these waves running wireless devices, which are in the radio frequency range, are dangerous. They're not natural, and they're not life conducive. And the other thing is that they're pulsed. They're also going on and off, as you'll see with a tracing on an oscilloscope that I'll show you in a moment. So here we have the spectral allocations of 2G, the first set were just 2 frequencies, 3G, the third generation of wireless, that were some 4 microwave frequencies, and then 4G, and LTE, which stands for long-term evolution. You see there's 5 or 10. And 5G, which is the last set of frequencies, doesn't really give up anything. In fact, 5G requires that we densify, that's a word the industry created, that we actually densify the number of antennas of 4G because 5G needs to operate in tandem with 4G. So we're going to have really all of that. They're going to give up 3G, and 2G is long gone. But they're going to add all these frequencies, and look how far up it goes, all the way to 95 gigahertz, or 95,000 megahertz. And by the way, that frequency is a weapon system. It's called the active denial weapon system. And it's used for crowd control. It causes people to feel their skin is on fire, and they would disperse crowds. So a so-called non-lethal weapon. And many of these frequencies, especially in the higher levels of 5G, impinge our skin, the largest organ in the body, which we know is essential for our health. If you burn too much of your skin, you die. And so it's like sticking our bodies now in low-level microwave ovens. That's what we're moving into with 5G. So here's more about why it's different from earlier generations. First of all, they're planning to cover the entire Earth, to bring wireless World Wide Web everywhere, including national parks, you know, places that were pristine and sanctuaries for nature. They're definitely installing these antennas in our national parks, I can tell you that. And so it's going to require millions more antennas that are strong emitters that are going to be placed near our homes, schools, and businesses. They're also going to install satellites and also drones. I'll show you some pictures of these new drones because some people don't want antennas in their backyard or in the easement areas around their homes. There's a lot of issues about that in neighborhoods and in cities trying to outlaw it with new city ordinances. And that's not going anywhere in California because the state made a law in California. It says we need 5G, and all these city ordinances that outlawed our bunk are just overruled now by the state saying 5G is essential to our business, to our lives. So all of you guys who worked as activists to create your new city ordinances, you have to bite the dust. It's too bad. So it's not about standard beams, standard broadcasting. I'll show you the difference between broadcasting like radio broadcasting and 5G, which are beams of higher power, more like lasers. Not exactly lasers, but they have that capacity. And it requires densification of 4G, as I already said. And these high frequency millimeter waves are used for radar. And there's no easy way to measure them over about 8 gigahertz. The ordinary meters, like this one I brought here to measure the room, does not work over 8 gigahertz. So you can't really measure 5G. A lot of people want to know, have they turned it on yet? I'm losing my hair, Beverly. What's the story? And I said, well, my meter doesn't measure over 8 gigahertz, so I can't measure that, all those frequencies above. Not yet. We're working on a meter at my lab for the people. Because if you want to measure it, you need to buy engineering equipment that costs $50,000 and up. So it really takes it out of the hands of the people to even know their exposure. We've been disempowered because we're living in a technocracy run by technocrats who make decisions about us and impose the technologies upon us. And that's what's going on with the vaccine. It's going on with 5G. It's going on in many realms of our lives today. So here's the difference between broadcasting like ordinary radio waves. And ordinary FM, AM radios are not a problem because they're not active emitters. They're just receiving waves. And that's how they work. So it's like throwing a stone in a pond and then the waves move out. And as they move a further distance from the source where the stone went in the water, the waves get weaker and weaker. But that's not true with 5G because it's a beam and it's going to be directed right at you. Whoever requires it to operate their 5G device is going to get a beam, at least for a few milliseconds, and all of that will add up. And in fact, that kind of beaming will drive people crazy. It's like if I stood at the light switch and flipped it on and off quickly, you would say, stop, stop, I can't stand it. My eyes want continuous light or none at all. But with 5G, it's about pulsations, very quick ones that no living thing can ever adapt to. That's the problem. So the infrastructure will be one good thing, fiber optic cables. Those things here, they look like the heavy cables at the bottom of the phone pole. And they're going to have many more cell phone towers, often with a shroud like that, like a lampshade. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's 5G. You won't be able to really distinguish looking at an antenna, whether it's 4G or 5G. Early on, they said they would look like that, but they're changing their minds all the time. 5G is a protocol. It's not a particular frequency. It's not a particular thing. And they're actually inventing it. It's kind of a loosely defined protocol, and the engineers are making this up as they go. So that's what it means. And of course, power supplies that look kind of like mailboxes. But fiber optics, which is light carried over glass fibers, and then encased in black plastic or something, that would be safe if we can get fiber optics all the way into the house, into the premises. I would applaud. And yet we're not going to get that. We're going to get a lot of Wi-Fi, like radiation. So I went to this website, and you can do this too, antennasearch.com. You can put in any address in the United States, and you can look and see what installations are there already. And this website was just updated for new installations in September of this year. So I did that for this address of the convention center, and I found some 80 cell towers and 259 antennas, and they're shown here on this map of Tinley Park and surrounding area. Now, I have to tell you, that's not much. I gave this talk recently in Silicon Valley, and I had to look up the address in Palo Alto, and it was about 3 times higher in the heart of Silicon Valley. So you may say, oh, it's horrific, but compared to some other places, it's pretty average. So, and so then you can see who is the installer of each antenna. So in here, it's T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, and others. and there's one called Jovan Broadcasting Corp. This does not include all of them, because nowadays, people are putting up or allowing big telecom to put antennas on their rooftops. How did that happen? Well, due to the lockdown and the joblessness that occurred, people are desperate to continue paying their mortgages. And big telecom, at least in California, is offering people, if they were willing to put up an antenna on the rooftop, they'll get paid $3,000 a month rent from AT&T or some other big telecom company to do so. But then, of course, they're blasting the neighborhood. They're blasting their own home and neighboring homes. Now, I'm getting clients who said, my children can't sleep anymore. The guy next door just put up an antenna on the roof, and what to do about it? I said, well, you need to get a meter like this, a handheld meter, and at least see what you can measure up to 8 gigahertz. I measured this room with this handheld meter before I was wirelessly wired up. And it was about minus 25, which is considerable, minus 25 decibels. And now that I'm wired up, let's see, because I'm using a wireless microphone and I have this thing right back here near my kidneys, not a good idea. Fortunately, it's only for an hour. Now it's minus 7 decibels. And if I get it close, I can probably, and you'll see, if you get yourself a meter, you'll notice the values jump around. And you'll say, well, what's wrong with my meter? No, nothing's wrong with your meter. That's exactly how you look at these meters, and you'll see pulsations change from minus 3 to minus 10, and it bounces all over the place. And sometimes it's in the red, the really bad zone. So that's how it really is coming out of these sources, just so you know that. They're also going to install some up to 100,000 satellites that will emit 5G. Now, presently, we have a few thousand satellites up there orbiting to do global positioning satellites and who knows what else. Probably surveillance, of course. I remember the first Sputnik in 1957. That was the first satellite the Russians launched when I was a little girl. And now, 2018, if we were to see the Earth from a distance, we would see all these satellites up there in the upper environment. And so some 4,425 satellites will bring the entire world online to this wireless World Wide Web. This is the plan, and it's companies like SpaceX, Elon Musk, Amazon is even installing some of these. Starlink is one of the brands. You can look it up. The astronomers are already finding these things are blocking the optical view of the universe at night. So it's really problematic, let alone that. Now here's the latest thing, drones bringing 5G. This is AT&T's new, they call them flying cows, and cow means cell on wings. And they put them up at some 300 feet. They're going to put them even higher. They're going to create a hybrid between a drone and a satellite and have these things up there as well. So at 300 feet, it serves 10 square miles, bringing 5G, and they can leave it up there for some time, for several days. Then they have to give it a new battery, I suppose. And so they're going to give 5G up to 100 times faster than 4G. They're selling it to the American public. Oh, you can download your movie in 6 seconds instead of 3 minutes. So of course you want this, right? Who wouldn't? And who didn't want 100 times faster internet? See, it's faster than the human nervous system. Who needs this stuff? Machines do. That's what it's about. So there are two main frequencies that really interfere with life. One is 2.45 gigahertz. That's the same frequency used in microwave ovens, if you so choose to use one. I don't recommend it. It really disturbs the structure of water, but that's another lecture. And you corrupt food by heating it quickly and disturbing all the protein structures and everything. But again, it's like we're in a low-level microwave oven, as this band will continue to be used in Wi-Fi, which will also be called Gi-Fi, as they get into the gigahertz range with it. And then 60 gigahertz, which will be used in local area networks, is absorbed by oxygen. And I tried to find papers on the role of that in the blood and the hemoglobin oxygen binding. I couldn't find anything, not in PubMed or Google Scholar. Nobody studied the safety of this stuff in terms of how it's going to influence our ability to absorb and move oxygen in the body. And you know, the whole hemoglobin oxygen thing is clearly unknown. And that's going to be a big use in 5G. all the local area networks. So we have two frequencies that really interfere with life. Now here's how it looks on an oscilloscope when you take a Wi-Fi router, this is a 4G, and you look at the signal coming out of those three little antennas that are covered with plastic. So even when it's doing nothing, it's just sitting there, it's in what we call polling mode. That means it's constantly sending out 10 pulses per second, what is 10 hertz. You see that on the full scale, 1 second at the top, 10 little pulse. And you see they're not even. There's some are higher than others. So that's the thing that's really disturbing, because 10 hertz is a brainwave. And you get something going on and off all the time. A Wi-Fi router just sitting around, whether you're using it or not, is in polling mode. So is that wireless desktop phone. It's not a cell phone, but it's one of those wireless phones that many people have in their homes. That's another big emitter. I recommend you get rid of them. So now, when you're in a downloading or uploading mode, you get a lot more pulsations as shown on the right. And you see they're all uneven. This is the thing that life cannot adapt to. And it's just crazy to make devices in polling mode, and almost all of them are. They're always asking the question, is there a user who needs me now? No. Is there a user who needs me now? No. Is there a user who needs me now? They're sending out pulses of information all the time. Who would make devices like this? It wastes energy. It's disruptive to life. I mean, you have to think, what was the mentality behind such a device? It's pure stupidity. But the engineers made it. Maybe it's easier for the circuits to handle it or something. Or maybe it's just diabolical. So, we don't have safety standards. People mention the word standards, but that's wrong. We have only guidelines, and we have only guidelines worldwide. And all the countries are different. And it turns out the United States and Canada have the worst, highest exposure limits of any country, which is another bad thing. And nobody can really set a safety standard because these waves are really toxic. And it depends on your age, pregnancy, and by the way, they're also cumulative. The damage that you ensue internally is not that different from ionizing radiation. And we know that for that, people wear a dosimeter, and they're very careful not to get too much near radioactive sources where ionizing radiation is. But this also is a problem, and we just haven't recognized it. It's sort of, I think back to tobacco smoke when I was a child and how it took so many decades to eradicate that as a social habit. But we're not going to easily eradicate cell phone use as a social habit because it's useful, unlike smoking. It's a useful thing to have a cell phone. And it's almost essential, really, to work in society, but we can use them in a wired way more safely. So nobody knows really how to set safety standards. There aren't any, and that has not been an issue. So here is society, pregnant women with their tablets near their abdomen, many people with smart watches, sticking the bra on your phone in a sports bra while jogging. I see women doing this and having conversations while they're on the trail. And children utilizing them. They should never be able to touch these devices. And of course, Bluetooth. Even Bluetooth hearing aids for the elderly, where you have constantly on 18 hours a day blasting your brain. It's just insensible. There are hardly any hearing aids without Bluetooth. I found one brand. So now I want to talk about our exposure guidelines. Take a look at this chart. Okay, natural Earth, the level of microwatts is like 10 to the minus 12th, if you count the number of zeros. We hardly get any microwaves from space, from the sun, but what we're allowing is 100 trillion times higher than nature. That's wrong. And the biobiologists, the people who are the building biologists who look at the safety of these things, call these levels already anomalies. In this room now, we're at this level, before I put on this wireless thing. We're in an extreme anomaly. We're at 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared. That's what I measured when I came in with my meter. And that's bad enough. But notice where other countries are with respect to guidelines. Belgium and Ukraine and Russia, they know more about these things. They've actually studied the influence of waves on living things much longer than in the United States. We looked at biomolecules, and Russia and Eastern Europe looked at the influence of electromagnetic waves on life. It's just two different styles. And as a result, a lot of European countries too have lower guideline exposures. China even does. I went to China and I used my meter, and I saw many more structures, antennas, etc. But when I measured the levels, it was lower than downtown San Francisco, for God's sake. I was shocked to see that because it's a higher density population in Beijing. But China has lower guidelines. We're up there. We're ridiculously high. So we ignore what's called the non-thermal effects of wireless. That's a complex thing, but it means in the US, they have this mannequin, and it's just a bust and a head. And inside they put salt water, and then they strap a cell phone around the head, and they put a thermometer in the middle, and they look to see whether there is heating up of that fluid inside that mannequin. And that's how they decided on our guidelines, strictly by thermal limit. And that's crazy because there are biological effects at much lower, what's called non-thermal limits. That was well known for 70 years. And I've been reading papers now on military databases that were previously classified and became unclassified the last 10 or 20 years. They were known during the Cold War that the Russians saw problems and used weapons. They actually blasted the US Embassy in Moscow with frequencies, and the personnel had health problems, and they were questioning it. And so they realized the Russians knew a lot more about this. And those papers became classified only to become declassified in recent years. So they're out there. So what are the effects of wireless radiation exposure? Here's a short list. Increased cancer risk, DNA damage, infertility, neurologic disorders, immune system dysfunction, both hyperactive as well as non-responsive, depends, and increased oxidative stress, which will just erode your health over time. And of course, children, pregnant women, and the elderly are the most vulnerable. I'm going to go quickly through this, having said that, because I want to go on to, there's neurotoxicity, etc. This one is interesting. This is what happens when you put a cell phone to your head. And in a child, the penetration of the very thin skull, which is just a fraction of a millimeter, the radiation goes much further in. And we know from umpteen biological experiments that developing organisms like children or young animals have the greatest biological adverse effects from this kind of radiation. So we should never give a device to a child. And yet there are even potty trainers for children with wireless screens. I've seen it. So they learn to multitask at a young age, learn to control their bowel movements and flip from screen to screen. It shouldn't be out there, nor should a wireless baby monitor be preferred because of radiation in the room. It's all wrong. So, immune system dysfunction, I'm very concerned about because of the picture with COVID. We see suppression of the immune response over long-term exposure to wireless. We also found in the literature hyperimmune responses, including the cytokine storms, which were found in some cases of COVID, particularly the more lethal ones. Depletion of T lymphocytes, that's also what happens in COVID. Your T cells just disappear like in HIV, in AIDS. And what you get in terms of the results on your immune system from these exposures depend upon the signal parameters. This was all done with animal studies largely, not people. So again, we don't have real data for real people. Just as with the vaccine, the latest booster, they only studied it on 8 mice. Did you know that? The Pfizer booster, no humans at all. Amazing. And they expect people to take that. So here's an important thing, because more and more people are getting electrosensitive, sometimes called electrohypersensitive. And they can't be around this stuff very long, or not at all in some cases, and they go out to rural areas just to exist. So there's a wide range of symptoms, and you don't have to have all of them. So disturbed sleep, headaches, other pains, nosebleeds and ear bleeds, tinnitus or ringing in the ears, fatigue, skin abnormalities, irregular heartbeats, heart palpitations, and things like even down to diagnosed with cardiac arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, impairment of memory and concentration, anger and behavioral issues. So it works at the level of psychology even, anxiety and agitation and depression. So it's been estimated now by holistic practitioners that some 30% of the US population has some level of electrosensitivity. mild, 5% moderate, and almost 1% severe symptoms. And that number is increasing. And even the American Disability Association recognizes, or the American Disability Act recognizes electrohypersensitivity as a health problem. And Medicare actually has some billable codes right now. So there is greater increasing understanding and labeling this in our population. So that's some good news. It doesn't solve the problem, but shows that there's an engaging awareness of the problem. There's also environmental aspects in terms of pollinators are thwarted. Take a look at bees. I'm a gardener, and I look at the bees, and they're acting so abnormally. They just fuss around on the soil. They're not going for the flowers, and they're sluggish, and some of it is agrochemicals, but some of it is this radiation. So they're really targeted, it seems. And in terms of microbial growth, it's disturbing to the microbiome. It seems to enhance pathogenic microbial growth over beneficial microbes, which is problematic. They have to cut down a lot of trees because 5G is blocked by trees. And in California, sometimes they're just cutting off the crowns of trees, leaving a trunk, which you know is going to probably die or just send up a few fronds. So this is crazy. And the large energy consumption, they talk about being green and lowering our carbon footprint. Well, this 5G is going to take huge energy consumption, and I don't see any of them addressing that. They're all pointing the finger at us and our gasoline engines and consumption of petroleum. It's just all hot air, really. So we don't have real health or safety studies on 5G real-world devices, which means the cell phones, the routers, all the new things that are coming with the so-called Internet of Things. Senator Blumenthal held a hearing in the Senate in 2019 where he asked the industry, well, what studies do you have to show safety? And they said none. None. Well, they said as long as we abide by the Federal Communications Commission's limits, we're legal. And so they wrote the laws. The FCC is a captured agency, just like the FDA is a captured agency. The whole government is really one big fascist mess right now. So, and nobody can get product liability insurance for cell phone radiation health effects. That's another telling thing. They know there's a health problem there. Who's going to pay for it? There was an interesting legal case by Children's Health Defense and Environmental Health Trust about a year ago where they sued the FCC and said, you've maintained the same standards for 26 years, yet you're increasing all this radiation with 5G. That can't be right. There's new data. And they won the lawsuit. But what's happening? A year later, I see no change. The FCC hasn't responded yet, making new guidelines. So we have to watch that FCC. They're slippery. There are a bunch of 6 people, and there's not a single health scientist or medical doctor among them. They're all people from the industry. That can't be good. So I want to tell you about my study on 4G in the blood. I conducted this some years ago with the 4G LTE phone, and it was sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation. And this was my research question. I do something called live blood analysis. You may know that's a holistic test looking at blood freshly drawn from a fingertip, placed in a microscope slide under dark field microscopy, and studying how it changes a little bit over time. And I was looking to see what happens initially, the baseline, before they had phone exposure, what happens after wearing a cell phone in a backpack for 45 minutes, what happens with working with a cell phone for an additional 45 minutes. So that was the study with 10 healthy adults. And I controlled the radiation exposure. They worked with the phone either in a backpack. I measured all these parameters, et cetera. So 10 people, quite a variety of age groups, 27 to 75, mean age 53, 8 women, 2 men. And most of them were eating the Weston A. Price Foundation recommended diet, which is the diet of our ancestors, a lot of pastured meats, raw milk and cheese, organic, low sugar, and pre-soaked, pre-sprouted nuts, etc. So the procedures, I already told you. So here is normal healthy blood, and there are the cells, the red blood cells. We see the edges in dark field, and a white blood cell caught in motion toward about 2 o'clock there. That's a polymorphonuclear leukocyte or a neutrophil. But this is healthy blood. This is actually the blood of Sally Fallon, Morell, who's president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and she doesn't mind me telling you that. She's got among the best blood I've ever seen. So that diet also, the blood of everyone on that diet also looks very good. And I've been doing this test for 25 years, and I've watched blood deteriorate as people are eating more processed foods and having more radiation in their environment. So here's on my study. I'll just show you a few cases. This is a woman at 75. She eats mostly Weston A. Price diet. Her blood isn't as good as Sally Fallon's baseline, and then carrying the phone. All the cells are now stuck in these snake-like forms called rouleaux, French word for rolls. And with that blood cannot carry oxygen through the tiniest microcapillaries in the body because cells have to go single file through that microcirculatory way. They can't go. They simply are restricted. So blood circulation to all your major organs is compromised. And furthermore, using the phone for an additional 45 minutes, you see these spiky cell formations, echinocytes, again, because there's spikes hanging out in the rounded red blood cells. They can't travel either through the capillaries. So here's another case. What happened? Whoops. Oh, here's a woman, and the toe blood was given because people say, oh, she's holding the phone, so the fingers are compromised. Well, the whole body is compromised because taking blood from the big toe, I saw the same picture. You can read this study. It's posted on my website. So 9 out of the 10 subjects showed unhealthy blood changes like this, where the blood cells first aggregate with short-term 45 minutes exposure, and then further exposure by working with the phone, the spiky cells form. And there's no clear protection from the diet, sadly. It's not good enough. Not enough. And looking at blood like this, it's the very picture of inflammation. When I see people who have inflammatory disorders or high levels of inflammation by other means like C-reactive protein or fibrinogen levels in the blood, I always see blood that looks like stuck together red blood cells in clumps and in rouleaux. And it actually are the early stages of blood clotting. Red blood cells come together, and that's what forms a clot. They stick together. So we're looking at an exacerbation of early blood clotting, and that's what 4G does and 5G. So this is not good. As I said, it impedes peripheral blood circulation, and 85% of our tissues require this microcirculation, but they're not getting it. And so we end up with hypoxemia and hypoxia, and that leads to diseases. I published this study in the journal Wise Traditions. You can find it at brubik.com/publications, freely available, where you see the blood of many people, not just the few that I showed here. When I realized what COVID was really all about early on, I realized that 5G and 4G would pose a threatening factor in this pandemic because of the blood clotting aspect. Because if it is a virus, whatever it is, I'm not going to argue it here, it's maybe coming in through the respiratory system, maybe the eyes, etc., but it's causing blood clotting, intravascular blood clotting, and that's a problem. And that's responsible for the hypoxia and the hypoxemia. It isn't a standard pneumonia at all. So this, I think, is a vascular disease, and the blood clotting that we see in the vessels leading to the hypoxemia, hypoxia, multiple organ damage, and organ failure is about clotting, inappropriate blood clotting. And exposure to wireless would exacerbate this. So then I set about writing a paper on this with a colleague, looking at this, which is on the CDC website, the epidemiological triangle, underlying every disease. This is standard epidemiology. There's an agent, in this case we're told it's SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's the health of the host that's to be considered, and there's the environment. But nobody's been talking about the environment in this whole pandemic. And yet it's been dragging on and on and on, and still it's not over with. And so that's a problem, but this is on the CDC website. Why are we not facilitating an open dialogue with scientists, which is the real scientific method of open discussion and not coming to an agreement that's solid and put out there? That's pseudoscience. That's a hijacking of the scientific method. Then I noticed this. This was on the Johns Hopkins website, the lower curve, showing the initial distribution of cases of COVID in April 2020. And I found this picture of the networks on another website and said, my God, look at the similarity between the 4G and initial 5G networks and the distribution of COVID in the world. I said, do you think it's only an accident? What about Wuhan, China, where the Chinese made it their model city for 5G? They turned on citywide 5G in late October 2019, and then we were told about the first cases in December 2019. Do you think there's not a connection here? We saw people dropping dead on television. You think it was all staged? What was really going on? We have to ask ourselves, and people are dying in new ways, even from the vaccine, that we don't even understand. So, I'm going to summarize this here with this chart. So, there are some adverse health effects of wireless that very much parallel the symptomatology and progression of COVID. We see the red blood cell clumping and early clotting with microwave exposure. And vascular clotting, both macro and microscopic clots that can't even be seen on medical imaging but require the D-dimer test, a special blood test to get at the D-dimers, what's going on there. Increased oxidative stress in both situations, immune system disruption in both situations, including both suppression and hyperactivation. Now, what microwaves do, they allow calcium to penetrate the cells more deeply. And calcium is really a second messenger. It's almost like a hormone. And this happens all over the body when you're exposed to microwaves. So your calcium gets dysregulated. And calcium inside the cell allows viruses to bind to the cell, to get in, to replicate, and to move out. It actually would exacerbate an infection. And there are long-term cardio and neurological effects from both exposure to wireless and COVID. And the same thing with the vaccinations, because it's a little piece of the virus, the so-called spike protein, that's doing essentially the same damage and even packaged in a lipoprotein container that has toxic lipids. So, the same adverse health effects of wireless will exacerbate the adverse effects of this particular vaccination. Now, so I made a conclusion, and you can read this in a paper that I published, that wireless exposure may exacerbate COVID-19 prevalence and severity by promoting some of the same ill health effects. And that wireless is an environmental stressor. It should have been considered in the pandemic. They should have halted the 5G installations, but in fact, they actually sped them up. This is the time when we were in lockdown in California, where we saw 5G going into the schools with unmarked vans and everything. Then it was revealed. Here too, yes. So I think, and I published this, that wireless exposure may exacerbate the adverse effects of COVID and also the vaccines. And we published this. I did this with a colleague from University of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Robert Brown. And there's our paper. It took, this was an extraordinary thing to get published, and I can tell you purely because I've published 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications in my career. And this thing took, they asked some 48 reviewers to review it. Never heard of that before. Usually it's 3 to 5. 12 people reviewed it. It took me almost a year to get it published. I had a lot of rejections from journals early on where they said, we're not touching this topic, just looking at the abstract or the title. And we had to write 74 pages of peer review to pass through the peer review. And I thought, my co-author was thinking, we don't know if we're going to get this thing published. I said, don't worry, Rob, because if we don't publish it in a journal, we've got a book. We'll get it out in a book, because that's already a lot of pages. We'll expose this journal, because the journals are now controlled largely by big pharma. So the science, medical science has really been hijacked, sadly. And I say it's bigger than that. Climate science has been hijacked. There's a lot of things that really have been hijacked. The other thing about wireless is that it can act synergistically with other toxins, because we're not operating in a vacuum here. We have an environment loaded with chemical toxins, increasingly, from agrochemicals like glyphosate, the herbicide, which is in all of us, according to a study. They took people who even eat organic food, they looked at the urine and they found glyphosate. It's in the literature now. And when you put microwaves on the brain, as you hold a cell phone or in a room with a Wi-Fi router, it disrupts the blood-brain barrier. And then these chemical toxins get right into the brain when normally they wouldn't be getting in as much. So it's exacerbating our problems of ADD, of memory, of concentration, of neurologic disorders, of increasing chronic degenerative diseases in general. So how can we protect ourselves? How am I doing for time? Oh boy. This is the part I really wanted to emphasize, but keep in mind there's a panel on this with Ty and Charlene Bollinger and myself tomorrow from 2 to 4. So if you didn't get enough of this today, come tomorrow. So I want you to know your exposure, get yourself a meter. It doesn't have to be this brand, I'm not selling meters, but I like the Cornet meter because it gives the values both in the microwatts per centimeter square and in dBm, the engineering unit. And I think it's more reliable than this unit. It also has a little LCD screen that shows the pulsation of these technologies. So measure levels. People say, oh, I've got this over here and that over here. How am I doing? I said, you know, if I couldn't come to your house and measure what you got, I don't know. Nobody can. So get yourself a meter and learn how to do this. Get together with neighbors or family. And it's not that difficult, really. I showed you a chart. I'm happy to make that available so that you can see where you are in that chart in exposure in your household, etc. We've all got to learn to reduce our exposures because I haven't found anything that protects us 100%. There are devices on the market, and I'll tell you this, buyer beware, because if they're not studied by an independent scientist like myself, and they're just studied by a few people by the company selling them, then there's possible bias and such things, and it's not sufficient. I want to see a peer-reviewed publication in a journal, or at least something with a lot of subjects posted on their website, done by another scientist who's not really connected with the company, and then I'll say, yes, this one will do something. The things I've tested so far have worked partially, some of them, and some of them not at all. And yet people feel safe. Oh, I've got the sticker on the backside of my phone. Must be okay, right? Or this case that's supposed to shield me. But there are edges where microwaves get out, and I find it doesn't shield that much. And this fabric, oh, I wear a shirt and this and that. You know, none of them work 100%. Let me talk a little bit more about them before they silence me here. So here's the meter I like, the Cornet, and there's a new one out now. Typical cost is about $200, but the upper limit is only 8 gigahertz right now. My lab is working on a people's meter for 5G where you'll see exactly what the frequencies are and you'll know what the heck device is contaminating your environment. So this is our meter in progress, the IFS inspector. IFS is the name of my company, Institute for Frontier Science. And we'll show people the various bands because no meter on the market does that today. It'll act as a dosimeter as well. And for that, we could use more funding. I put that out there because we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and anybody who donates money to our cause, which is your cause, is tax deductible in the US. So here's how we can reduce our exposure to radiation. We should keep the phone, according to the manual, deep inside your phone if you can find it. You should keep your phone at least an inch away from your body. I keep mine on airplane mode most of the time. I also turn off the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and any hotspots that may be in the area. You want to turn all that off except when you're using it, turn it on briefly and then turn it right off again. Right now I'm using wired Ethernet DSL. I never moved on to wireless. I knew that that was ridiculous because it's not as good as wired. Wired is always superior. It's there, it's constant. And we were somehow moved along to wireless because, oh, well, you're running around the house operating your little computer. How crazy is that? You sit down at a station and you operate your computer, usually. We want to eliminate the cordless landline phones because they're toxic. I'll take questions at the end. And any wireless mouse and keyboard because that's ridiculous. You have to put batteries in these things. You want them wired. Of course you do. We want wires should be our mantra. Yes. So, almost done. So you can get yourself safe technology. You can try to get 5G optical fiber to the premises. Just demand it. Turn off the wireless on your router. You can have a timer on it. You can have it go off at night and come on in the morning without thinking. You just put a simple $10 timer on the circuit. Shielded Ethernet cables and Ethernet switch, if you can use Ethernet where you live. I know they're phasing it out where I live. There are cell phone data cables where you can use your wireless cell phone in a corded way. And there are corded landlines. They still sell them. They're hard to find. And you can also go to estate sales and find the old phones that are totally safe. So there's clothing and shields for the bed and all kinds of things. They only work partially. I put a meter on the interior of those things. I realize there's still radiation coming in here, but it's helpful. It reduces it, and that's important. SafeEMF.com is one website. I'm not involved with it, but I do recommend it, and there are plenty of others. And I already talked about this. The purported protective devices are so far inadequately studied, and I'd like to study more. Again, I could use more funding at my lab to do this as a nonprofit. Earthing is another way. Get barefoot, get out on the ground of the earth, get yourself grounding devices or earthing devices. That's been proven with a paper by Sinatra back in 2017 that it reduces EMF stress. So it's a viable thing. And you don't have to go outside to do this. You can get yourself a certain tether for the ankle and connect it to the ground in the house, or connect it out the window via a wire to a ground in the earth. So that's a real serious way to reduce your body's response to wireless. So I believe that we should have a moratorium on 5G. I'm not alone with that. There were many activists, many other scientists and physicians who signed all kinds of documents online to try to stop this madness. I don't think we've succeeded. It's clear that 5G is a very important part of the technocracy in which we find ourselves that we'd like to undo. And so we need to demand it to stop. It's absolutely insane. They're creating a world and terraforming the earth for a world of robots. And life as we know it cannot survive or thrive in such an environment. So we must stop this madness. And if we don't stop 5G, they'll be on to 6G. And do you know what that is? That's the Internet of Bodies. That's where we get hooked to the internet. And some of these substances that are in injections given today, and even in past ones, sadly have materials that could act as antennas for the millimeter waves. Substances like graphene oxide, for example. And what's the purpose of that in an injection? Ask yourself. Some toxic solid nano fabrication thing like that. It's unclear, but it's diabolical. Here's a project I want to do, and that's the last thing I'll say. I want a clear zone ranch, and I'd like to see these things proliferate all over. I want to build a ranch somewhere. I don't know, it doesn't have to be California. I'm ready to get out, believe me. I want an open community. I want a research and educational facility where we can study the influence of these things, because we've got to stop it somewhere in order to know what's real health. Just as we look at the unvaccinated small populations on Earth to understand what's real health. The people who had so few vaccines compared to today's 70-something schedule of vaccines for children. In this structure, we'll have no wireless 5G, but we will have wired using the fiber optics to the premises, and we'll use infrared wireless, which is safe and actually healthy. We'll have a place for the electrosensitive, and this will be a high-tech demonstration ranch. And we want this thing cloned. We want to see it go viral in a good sense. So I'm seeking investors, philanthropists, and like-minded business partners for this venture. So my conclusions are as follows. Wireless radiation poses hazards to all of us, to our health and to the environment, and everybody's at risk. It's more hazardous than previous generations, the 5G. It involves 4G densification, more and more antennas, infrastructure on Earth and in space. It has adverse health effects that I skimmed over here, but you can read, which are very much detailed in my paper on 5G and COVID, that shows what an environmental stressor it would be, and in exacerbating the adverse effects of both the pandemic and the material in the vaccines. We need health and safety studies by independent scientists, both on the 5G effects of real-world devices and on the protective devices that people have proposed. But I want to tell you this, and this is where there's greatest hope. Your exposure is more controlled by you than you think, because we found going to a number of people's homes and offices that their greatest exposure was really from the devices within their own homes and businesses. In other words, you know, they don't think about it, but they've got the wireless router just 5 feet from where they work or sleep. And they've got a bunch of other wireless devices, the cordless landline, et cetera, just around them. And so we need to get rid of these things or shield them or put them as far away as possible from where you sleep and work and spend most of your time. So there we can take personal action to protect ourselves and teach others. And you can learn to use a lot of your wireless devices as a wired device, at least where you're sitting in your home. It's quite possible. There are ways to do this. So I've just touched on it here, and I look forward to conversation, if not now. We can for a few minutes, I think. I'll stay around, and also tomorrow at our panel.